Hello and welcome to another video from the Biblical Timeline. Today we're going to talk about Judges. The book of Judges is a bit of a challenge for reasons that we'll see in a minute, but we will do our best to come up with a reasonable timeline for that period that fits everything that the scriptures say and any other evidence that we can come up with. So why bother? Well, I think it's really important that we understand the larger context of the book of Judges, who the other powers are that the people of Israel are interacting with, what's the general kind of political environment, what are the other things that are going on around them at this time, just to get a better understanding of what's happening. This was Thiele's approach in developing the chronology for the book of Kings and Chronicles. And I think we want to do the same thing here. So now at the same time, I kind of want to head off the haters here. I'm sure I will get comments disagreeing with this timeline. And I think particularly for Judges, this quote is very apropos. If we think about this, this is a really difficult one. There have been lots of different solutions over the time. I will show you a couple of alternative solutions that people have come up with. But this is really a place where there's no way to know exactly, year by year, how all this works out. I think I've come up with a really good solution, and I would hope that you would evaluate this with an open mind. I think it really covers all of the evidence that we have in Scripture and some extra biblical information as well to get to the best possible timeline. But I recognize that some of you will not want to accept some of what I have to offer. So per Eusebius, this could be really a futile undertaking, and that's why he cautions us, but we're going to make an attempt anyway. All right, so what's going on here? Well, we have two problems. We have too many years and we have not enough years at the same time. So if we start looking at this, what the book of Judges gives us is a series of judges, initially a series of oppressions. A judge comes in and does something, wins a battle or assassinates a leader in order to end that oppression, and then there's a period of peace. And we get initially the sort of 40-year multiples. As we transition into the latter half of the book, we start to see what I believe is an uninterrupted sequence of judges. We still have oppressions. But if you take all of this together, we add it up, it adds up to 450 years. So that's the book of Judges plus the 40 years that are given to Eli in 1 Samuel. And this is referred to by Paul in a speech in Acts 13, where he says he gave them judges for about 450 years until Samuel the prophet. And if you just literally take all the numbers in the book of Judges, add them up, add Eli as the last person who's called a judge, you get exactly 450 years. So that's great. However, we're missing some things. First of all, on the left side, the book of Judges opens us by telling us that the people of Israel continue to follow God all the years of Joshua and the elders that outlived Joshua, before then falling into sin and the beginning of the first oppression. So there's a period of time between, in particular, the conquest of the land and this first oppression, and nowhere in Scripture does it give us a number of years for that. But we have to allow some extra time for that to happen. The oppression before Othniel can't start immediately after the conquest, because at that point, clearly Joshua and other elders of Israel are still alive. So we've got to fill in that gap. On the other side, we have a second problem, which is we have Samuel and Saul. Now, nowhere in the Old Testament does it give us years for either. So Samuel clearly judges Israel for a period following Eli. He's then succeeded by Saul, and then only at the death of Saul, then we go into David. So we need to figure out what the numbers are for Samuel and Saul. Now, I know that in Acts, there is a passage where it gives 40 years as the time for Saul. I am going to challenge that. I believe that's way too long. Again, it's not attested anywhere in the Old Testament. There is a verse in 1 Samuel that would seem to have indicated the reign of Saul, but it's been corrupted. It's fragmentary in all translations. So we're going to look for some other sources to try and understand why people living in the first century would say that Saul was a 40-year period. All right, so this is what we've got. Now, we have to squish this in to a shorter period. The book of Kings, chapter 6, verse 1, says that there were 480 years elapsed from the Exodus to the 4th year of Solomon when the foundation for the temple was laid. So that gives us a period that we need to sort of squish this into. And from that, we first need to deduct the 40 years for the wilderness wandering on the left side, and we need to deduct 44 years for David and the first 4 years of Solomon on the right side. We'll talk later about where 40 may be a sort of a literary construct and not an exact 40 years versus where it is. I will say that the wilderness wanderings, I think Scripture is very clear on that it was exactly 40 years. And in the case of David, actually it was 40 years and 6 months, 7.5 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. So you get, I think we're being pretty confident that those 40s are correct, and we put that all in, and it leaves us 396 years to get from the crossing of the Jordan to David. But as you see above, we've got 450 years plus 2 unknown amounts to squish into that period. So that really becomes our challenge, is how do we compress what we have from the book of Judges and this unknown information into that period of time. Now, we do have one other key clue. There's one and only one passage that tells us how much time has passed from the conquest of the land to any particular judge, and that relates to Jephthah. And in Judges 12:7, he makes a statement that it has been 300 years since the start of the conquest. In Josephus, it's quoted as above 300 years. But we have that milestone, and we need to make sure that we include that in thinking about where to place the judges on the timeline. So this is the beginning, and let's see where we go from here. Well, I'm going to start by talking about some other attempts at resolution. Perhaps the most famous modern approach to working this out was by Bishop Ussher. He wrote basically just from documentary evidence, no archaeology, in the late 1600s. And this is his chronology. See in the initially in the dark blues and then the gray over to the right. So he used 40 years for Saul. He used a period of, I think, 30-some years for Samuel. And you'll see he had a period in there for Joshua and the elders. And his big solution to this was overlapping the periods of oppression with the periods of the judge. So you'll see here he has 40 years from Joshua to Othniel, 80 years from Othniel to Ehud, including the oppression by Moab, 40 years from Ehud to Deborah and Barak, including the oppression by Jabin, and so on, until we get to Gideon, and then he sort of lays them out linearly as you see, starting in the blue and then in the gray. The problem with this particular timeline from Ussher is he didn't recognize the 300 years of Jephthah. And so he has Jephthah way too early. This was revised by Floyd Nolan Jones in his, I think, 2017 Chronology of the Old Testament. He correctly moves Jephthah to the earliest place or where he could be, which is 1107 BC, which creates an odd gap in here, and then has both of them have Samson overlapping Samuel, which is kind of a strange thing. So I had looked at these when I was trying to build my timeline originally. I just found that these were a bit too problematic, and that was what led me to doing the research that got me to the timeline that I'm presenting to you today. Okay, one of my realizations in going through the book of Judges is that it contains what I will call early and late periods. If you think back to the chart we were just looking at, we have 2 different patterns. In the beginning of the book, it's judge, and then 40-year period or 80-year period, and then another oppression, and then another judge, and nothing in between. Nobody's mentioned in between those. But when we get to the later period, it looks like we have a continuous sequence of judges. And one of the things I noticed from Josephus was he actually kind of mentions this, that a number of the judges, he says, did nothing. So we have these unremarkable judges in that later period. If we look at how this works out, we have the dashed line there is sort of what separates them. So we have a remarkable judge from Othniel, from a 40-year gap to Ehud, who's another remarkable judge based on what he did, an 80-year gap to Shamgar and Deborah, who were remarkable and did important things, and then another 40-year gap to Gideon, and so on. Starting from Abimelech, however, we have this unbroken string of judges. We have Abimelech, followed by Tola and Jair, who are unremarkable. Jephthah defeats the Philistines in Ammon. Then we have sort of 3 unremarkable judges, and then we get to Samson. So this, to me, was perhaps the epiphany in coming up with this timeline, is that early on, it seems that Scripture only records the important judges, but starting with Abimelech, it seems to record everyone as if like a king's list, like the book of Kings does later. So we want to use this in our timeline. All right. Okay, now, continuing with Josephus, I think he's really the key to all of this. So what I've done here is use Josephus to fill in the gaps that I mentioned earlier. You'll see in this chart the list of events on the left, the biblical references for those events, and the years given in Scripture for those events. And what you'll see is there are some gaps, specifically from the completion of the conquest, which I think we can place 7 years after the beginning, to the death of Joshua and all the elders and the beginning of that first oppression. There are no years given. But if we go to Josephus, we see that he gives a total of 43 years from the beginning of the conquest to the beginning of the first judge, to Othniel. So that would include the conquest years, 7, 8 years of oppression, so that's 15. If we subtract 15 from 43, we get 28 years from the end of the conquest to cover the death of Joshua and all the elders, and then the onset of that first oppression. So this, I think, is a reasonable number. If you think about, how much time you would need for people to forget about all that God did in Egypt and the wilderness and through the conquest, you need kind of a generation, and that's basically what that 28 years gives you. The other thing in this chart that is not given really by either is Shamgar, and we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. The Scripture does not give any years for Shamgar. It mentions him, but with no years. Josephus says he ruled less than 1 year. I actually think that Josephus is incorrect here. What I see is in the Song of Deborah, in Judges 5:6 specifically, Shamgar's mentioned. In the days of Shamgar, says Deborah. So what I believe here is that Shamgar was in parallel with probably somewhat of that 80-year period following Ehud, and was also obviously still alive when Deborah was ruling. She probably began her to judge before the events, the battle which really sets her up as the premier judge. So I think what we're dealing here is overlap. So it was not necessary to give any years for Shamgar, because then we would just be further inflating the timeline. So that is kind of my position on him. One really curious thing here, Josephus in Antiquities 5.198 curiously says that there was really a short breathing time after the Moabites before the oppression of Jabin began. Now, that's really odd, given that this is the longest breathing space, 80 years instead of 40, between Ehud and that next oppression. So really kind of wondering what he meant there. But we're going to go with what Scripture says at this point, and we'll just be left to wonder what Josephus was thinking. So altogether, these things comprise the early period, and you'll see where they both give numbers. The Bible and Josephus match exactly. Josephus just happens to fill in that blank that we had on the left side of our timeline for Joshua and the elders. Now, if we go to the late period, again, where they both give a number, Josephus and Scripture match exactly, which is good. We have some interesting things here. Now, Tola, who's mentioned in the Bible, given 23 years, is actually missing in Josephus, so not even mentioned. So I find that really interesting, and we'll think about what that might mean as we put our timeline together. Abdon is mentioned, but not given any years. So I'm not sure if that was just an oversight. Scripture gives him 8 years. And then as we go on, the other really critical thing is that Josephus gives us years for Samuel and Saul. He gives a total of 32 years for both of them, 12 to Samuel and 20 to Saul. Now, some versions of Josephus will, in some places, give 40 for Saul. But if you actually look at it and look at all the references, the 40, I think, was a later edit by someone trying to reconcile with the numbers in the 40 years in Acts. So all indications from Josephus is he meant 20. I believe that the 40 years that we see in Acts is a conflation of Samuel and Saul, and possibly the 7.5 years that began David's reign. So that 40 years would basically cover from the loss of the ark to the installation of the ark in Jerusalem. So that would be a nice round number for people to think of. Actually, it's, I think, 39.5 years, so almost exactly there. But I believe that is where people would learn 40 in sort of Hebrew school in the first century. And I'm going to go with the numbers that Josephus gives us generally. Now, I actually have published an article on Saul where I give him only 12 years. Doesn't really matter for this purpose. The total of 32 is what matters to get us to the right point. You can invert Samuel and Saul. There are good arguments for why Saul might be 20 years. I think I've given some good arguments why he is at least 12 years. So exactly what you put there doesn't matter so much as the total of 32. Now, the other interesting thing here is if you add all of this up and you take kind of a composite picture, you take Josephus's 570 plus the 2 things he was missing, the 23 for Tola and the 8 for Abdon, you get a total of 601 years that has to be compressed into the 480 years in 1 Kings 6:1. So we really have some work to do. Alternately, you can look at it as 517 years that we have to squeeze into 396, but kind of that round 600 versus 480 is kind of maybe easier to think about it that way. So now let's get started on our timeline. I'm going to start, as I said, at the end and work my way back. So this is what I'll call the late period. In fact, this doesn't involve judges at all. All this is from information in 1 Samuel and then into Kings with Solomon, obviously. So if we start from Solomon, the beginning of his reign was 970 BC, so 4 years in was 966. We're going to put David right before Solomon at 40 years, of which 7 were in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. And then that gets us to Saul. So on that basis, Saul would have ended his reign in 1010. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm only going to give Saul 12 years here. You could just as easily give him 20. Regardless, Samuel would still start in 1042. It's a question of just the length of Saul's reign. No matter what happens, Samuel dies 2 years before Saul. So it just really affects the overlap. So we can be confident with a 1042 start date for Samuel based on Josephus's 32 years. And then that places Eli from 1082 to 1042 BC. And we'll see here I've marked the Battle of Ebenezer, where the ark is lost, and the Battle of Mizpah in 1022, which is really the beginning for Saul. So that's what we get from 1 Samuel, and now we can actually dig into Judges. So now we'll start to look at the Philistine oppressions. There are 2. We're now into the book of Judges. We have 18 years with the Philistines and Ammon, and then a 40-year oppression with just the Philistines. So the Philistines and Ammon is right before Jephthah. The 40 years of the Philistines is an interesting one. I'm showing it here in parallel with Eli's 40 years, but I think realistically it actually slides to the right. Samson is said to have been born at the beginning of that impression, and that he would begin to remove it. So it may be that the impression really starts in 1062 BC with roughly the birth of Samson and goes through to the Battle of Mizpah, which would be 40 years. So exactly where you want to slide it in there, I think there's some options. I think the Philistines were sort of actively involved with Israel throughout that entire period. But fundamentally, the oppression here is in parallel with some of the judges. As we look at this late period, we have this continuous string of judges, and therefore the only place to put these oppressions is in a parallel mode, and that is actually one of the biggest things that gets us compression here. By putting Eli and the Philistines in parallel with the other judges, we've just taken 80 years out of the timeline, which is a kind of giant sigh of relief and means there's a whole lot less to worry about earlier on. The other thing I want to mention here is Samson. So as you might recall, Usher, Nolan Jones put him in parallel with Samuel. I don't think that's viable. I think the first Samuel account is clearly after the end of the Judges period, so Samson is off the scene at least before the Battle of Ebenezer. I and others have put the death of Eli and the death of Samson essentially at exactly the same time. I don't think that's necessary. It doesn't say that in Scripture. What I think Scripture implies is that the death of Samson was probably not long before the death of Eli and the Battle of Ebenezer. So we could slide Samson a little bit to the left, 2, 3, 5 years perhaps. That means a little bit more compression in the earlier judges, but I think there is an opportunity to do that. The other thing that this gives us is Jephthah. He's about 315 years after the arrival in the land, which fits the at least 300-year requirement. So we have everything adding up for this late period. And I think generally I like this solution. It doesn't leave any gaps. We'll see that in a minute, and seems to meet all the requirements. Now, if we're going to fill out the late period, we're going to add the judges before Jephthah, which are Abimelech, first person to sort of claim to be king of Israel, Tola, and Jair. Now, those guys ruled about the same time, 22 years for one, 23 for the other. I am placing them in parallel with the oppression, because the Philistine oppressions in particular. And that's because I believe from Abimelech on, what we have is we have a continuous line of rulers where one goes to the next and to the next and the next. So any oppression would naturally then be in parallel with the judges. And that's the way I've placed it here. Now, when we get to the early period, we basically have two options. So we're talking about before Abimelech. If you want to be sort of a Bible purist and say that the 40 years and 80 years are exactly those number of years, you have to go with what I show here as option 2. In that case, what we have to do is we have to find about 22 years to take out. And surprise, surprise, that's basically what we have with Tola. So if we move Tola and Jair in parallel, and remember that Josephus did not give years for Tola. So if we say, okay, the reason he did that is because he was in parallel with Jair, we can exactly fit what we need in here with exact 40-year intervals. And again, that's the option 2. The alternative is to look at those 40 and 80-year intervals as more schematic. So remember that in Acts, we have Saul having 40 years when realistically it might have been 32 of Samuel and Saul, maybe 39 with the moves of the ark, but not an exact 40 years. And so what we're looking at in option 1 at the top is an approach where we say, okay, 40 years sort of. Give or take, we need to take out 22 years. That has us reducing each 40-year interval to about 35 years and the 80-year interval to 70 years. And then everything fits with that small amount of compression. Now, again, I'm not overlapping the judges and the oppressions. I'm overlapping the judges and the pieces that followed, right? They don't give any specific years for any of the judges in this period, and not until Abimelech. And I've layered Shamgar in here in both instances as somewhere before the oppression of Jabin is where he's first mentioned, but he's clearly still alive when Jabin's defeated in the Song of Deborah. So I've got him spreading over that, but again, there's no exact years. So my personal preference here is option 1, but again, depending on how you want to look at this, you can go either way. And so I'm offering you 2 solutions. Now, let's look at what this does in terms of the Orthodox chronology. Now, the power in what we now call Israel at that time was Egypt. And so if we lay out the Egyptian timeline, this is on the Orthodox or Standard Chronology, what you might find in Wikipedia. This is how it looks at the bottom. So we have an Exodus under Amenhotep II, entering the land under Tutmosis IV. And the Egyptians are very active throughout all of this. So Ramses the Great is, during the time of Jabin, that you'd have to assume then that Jabin would have been a vassal of Ramses in order to dominate that area. Same with Midian. As you get later, Ramses III and beyond, now we get the Sea People, so it's possible that we have some disruption of Egyptian hegemony in Palestine. And then as we get to the Philistines, they more look at them as the Sea Peoples or as Sea Peoples, which I think they are. To some extent, it's just a question of really when they come into the picture and if there are subsequent waves. Because we get into dynasties 20 and 21. At this point, Egypt is now getting a lot weaker, and that opens the door in the Third Intermediate Period for David and Solomon to dominate that area. So that's the Orthodox chronology. The big issue I have here is with Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. No Mesopotamian ruler would have been able to come in and dominate Palestine and oppress Israel during the time of Amenhotep III, which is where he would fall. Maybe a bit with Akhenaten, but there's no real evidence of that. So something is off, particularly there, but also the fact that you have Eglon and then Jabin, that they are oppressing Israel at a time when they would have to have been under Egypt, and I just don't see that particularly really for either of them. So this is one of the things that got me looking at the new chronology, particularly the Exodus, where it fell, looking at the Judges period. It just didn't seem to add up for me. So I wanted to look at it in the new chronology, and that's what we have here. So in the new chronology, things look very different. So everything's for Egypt slides to the right, and what we have is an Exodus during the Second Intermediate Period under a pharaoh named Dudimos or Menethos Tudemos, where we have sort of really evidence of some of the events of the Exodus falling. That also means that with Egypt kind of on the sidelines in this period, definitely you can have incursions into Palestine from Mesopotamia, from the Mitanni, with Christian Rishathaim, that Moab could dominate it for a while, that a local king from Hazor could dominate for a while. All of these make perfect sense because Egypt is not active in Canaan, really, at that time, anywhere in that time horizon on this timeline. That they don't really come in until the end of the reign of Amos, who has pushed out the Hyksos kings from the Nile Delta, taken full control back of Egypt. Now we have a single strong ruler for the entire country, and he begins to expand back into Canaan in particular. It's interesting that his first campaign seems to correspond with part of the 7-year oppression from Midian. So not sure if there's a relationship there or not, if the Midianites were taking advantage of a power vacuum that was created by the Egyptian campaigns, if they were somehow vassals of Egypt or otherwise related, unclear. The next campaign happens during the reign of Tutmosis I. Doesn't seem to correspond to any of the oppressions, actually falls right in the middle of Gideon's 40-year peace. And may have, now Tutmosis goes all the way to the Euphrates, so he may have just been passing through, and he doesn't come back for a while, so that may be why it's not mentioned as a lengthy oppression. And And then the really interesting thing to me is when we get to Thutmose III, he campaigns for 19 years in Canaan. And based on my timeline, those years correspond pretty much exactly with the 18 years oppression under the Philistines and Ammon. And we know that the Philistines, from the Amarna letters, were vassals of Egypt. So we can see Egypt's hand moving behind that oppression. And the years, the fact that they match Thutmose III exactly, to me, that's a significant confirmation that this is the right timeline. We do have some other campaigns at the end of Thutmose III, and then moving on to Amenhotep II. He's a very strong pharaoh, campaigned extensively in Canaan, which is another good reason why he's not the pharaoh of the Exodus. And you have this lengthy period of Philistine, and again, that's really Egyptian hegemony that parallels Samson and Eli and into the period of Samuel, and really doesn't end until the Battle of Mizpah. So I personally prefer this timeline over the old chronology because it seems to really match very, very well with the events. Also, David Roll has linked Saul with Labiah in the Amarna letters, and that, of course, lines up perfectly with this timing with the Akhenaten. So I said, big fan of this, particularly for the Judges period. And but decide for yourself. I've given you both, and I hope you've enjoyed my presentation, because that is the end. Thanks again for watching.